Welcome. Thanks for joining us, John. I wonder if you could start us off by introducing us to you as a writer. What has your journey been like, and what do you like to work on?
Absolutely. Well, I've always enjoyed writing. When I was a kid, I would love to write scary stories and tell them to my friends, or like sit around a campfire and tell a scary story to other Boy Scouts. I've started writing more semi-professionally around 2012. I got my start on Reddit's No Sleep community, writing like sort of like, are they true, are they not, kind of horror stories from the early days of the internet. And from that point, I started writing for a lot of different podcasts: the No Sleep podcast, Creepy Pods, Doctor No Sleep, and a couple anthologies as well. I've just always kind of tried to improve as a writer and focus on three different kinds of writing. I like to do like kind of like a literary experimental writing. I like to tell just your classic campfire horror stories as well. And then I like to try to combine the two into like some new formats. That's me as a writer.
Cool. Well, we're super happy to have you as a contributing author for Cost of Living. Your story is really neat, and we'll get there in just a minute. As an additional way of helping us to get to know you a little bit, could you tell us what you're reading right now, who you enjoy, if you have any recommendations?
Sure. The first recommendation that came to mind is a short story by John Connolly called Blood of the Lamb. And it's a story that I won't spoil anything about it, but what I like about it is the way that the author builds tension and leaves the reader wondering what exactly is going to happen. Where is this going? And I really like that in a horror story. I mostly, because I write a lot of fiction, I read a lot of nonfiction, and it can be very inspiring for me. I recently read a biography of the artist Caravaggio called A Life Sacred and Profane, which was a really interesting look into like what life was like on the streets of Rome in the 1500s, and these kind of like darker, grimmer, harder times that humans lived through. And I read a lot of historical horror, and so I draw a lot of inspiration from the nonfiction I read.
That's interesting. I have a similar kind of experience, and I'm going to check out that book on Caravaggio. He's one of my favorites. His stuff in the Borghese Gallery in Rome is really worth checking out. If you've ever been to that, it's a private gallery in the Via Borghese. The Via Borghese is like this sprawling manor complex and affiliated parks, and the villa itself is a sculpture and painting museum, and they only let a few people in at a time, so you kind of have.
Well, that's a good feeling, yeah.
And that was before I mean, I was there in 2011, so they have been doing that for a long time. They let 20 or 30 people in the building at a time, and it is really cool to have that open space and to be able to just stand there with the Caravaggios and be alone with them and experience the darkness that they're bringing.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. The only one of his I've seen face to face is in the Prado Museum in Madrid, which is Judith beheading Holofernes, and just this like gruesome. I don't know, there's something just so powerful about like the light and the darkness and the emotion that he conveys through paint. It's
the heavy oil painting, the heavy oils that he's using to paint help to bring that, like it's like very visceral.
Yeah,
in front
visceral
of
is exactly the word I was looking for, indeed.
Yeah, and I think if for those in the States, I'm pretty sure there's, if not Caravaggio's, then his students' stuff in the Met in New York.
Nice.
Yeah, it was an odd thing I had where I was standing in front of this painting and I thought, this really looks like a Caravaggio, but it turns out it wasn't. It was like his direct students' work, and it was pretty interesting to be able to make that connection. As somebody who doesn't know very much about art, to be able to make that connection was kind of cool.
Same. I'm very much in the pictures look pretty camp when it comes to art. I'm not. I don't know a whole lot about it, but
could you introduce us to your story? Your story is Decorations in Costs of Living. I wonder if you could introduce us to it, and without spoiling, I'm thinking that this video might be viewed by people who have already read the story, who may not have read it yet, but who might be curious about the inspiration for the fellow who wrote the tale. Could you tell us a little bit about what was on your mind as you wrote it, or what inspired you to write it?
Absolutely. So Decorations started out a very long time ago when I was a small kid reading a book called Scary, Scary Halloween, which was sort of an illustrated book about Halloween from the perspective of a stray cat. It was a book designed with small children in mind. It had some really beautiful illustrations. But in the story, the cats are very frightened because they don't really know what's going on Halloween night, and they don't really know how much of it's real, how much of it's fake, how much they should take seriously, how much they should be afraid of. And I remember on my first experience trick or treating, I had a similar feeling, whereas part of me was having a lot of fun, and another part of me was a little afraid, wondering how much of this is real. And so those early trick or treating experiences in the late 80s, early 90s were part of the inspiration for this story. Another part of the inspiration for this story, too, was just growing up in a small southern town, and these kind of like themes that come up a lot when you live in a small town of like, what are the dangers of conforming? What are the dangers of not conforming? What are the sacrifices you have to make as a person to conform or to not conform? How do you decide which path you're going to take?
Those kinds of questions definitely come out pretty clearly in your story, and I hope that everybody gets a chance to read it. I wonder, when you tell people that you like to read or to write horror, they probably have some impression in their mind of what that means. Either they like it or they don't like it. I wonder, for you, what does horror mean? Whether that's a genre concept or something else, what is horror to you?
For me, I think horror means helplessness. Like, horror means you are facing something overwhelmingly powerful that you don't understand. And it's how you respond to that, how you either overcome it or succumb to it, maybe even become part of it. And I think that's why horror resonates with so many people, because in our lives, we are surrounded by powerful forces that we don't always feel like we can control and that we don't understand. And that can suddenly come at us out of nowhere, that we thought we were having a perfectly ordinary day. And suddenly there is this great and unexpected danger. And I think that's why horror speaks to me as a genre.
The first one that I've interviewed so far, of the 10 who specifically said it's about helplessness, and it's something that I've heard before and really speaks to me as a reader. And I don't necessarily read horror to feel fear, but I do kind of empathize with the character who's in this helpless position, and I get to kind of safely experience. I mean, it is very scary to be helpless, and I get to have a safe experience of that empathetic relationship there. Curious, what drew you in? Our call for submissions, for anybody who hasn't seen it, asked for social, psychological, suburban horror, and then gave kind of some examples of what that might mean. But we're a new press and not on everybody's list to submit to. So I wonder what drew you in about the call? Why did you submit? Because we're certainly glad you did.
I heard about the call through Submission Grinder, which is a website that collects a lot of calls for short stories and for poems, other works. And it's a site that I usually check about once a month. In addition to writing for podcasts, I also like to write for publications as well. And so usually I'll get on the Submission Grinder and I'll see what if there are stories that I have that would be a good fit for some of the calls, or also to find ideas as well. Sometimes I'll see a call and it will really inspire me to write something new. So that's how I came across the press.
Folks who may be newer at submitting things for publication, Submission Grinder is a great resource. I personally have found it really easy to navigate, and it's helpful as it has these cool filters to help us find exactly the sort of thing that we're looking for. I also like to write to a prompt. If I just sit down to write a story, sometimes it doesn't just hit me, and going to Submission Grinder or Horror Tree, looking at those calls might spur something in my mind like, oh yeah, I do have an idea for that kind of a thing. So I'm sure that the newer folks, newer writers will be happy to get that experience-based advice about check out Horror Tree and check out Submission Grinder and these other sites that collect and amalgamate the calls. I wonder what's next for you. What do you? This video is probably not going to come out for many months, probably 9 or 10 months. But in the next year or two, what do you have on the horizon? What do you intend to keep doing? Do you have any particular goals that you'd like to accomplish in the next year or so?
Essentially, when a while back when I started writing, I had the idea of putting out sort of a quarterly compilation of my stories that appear on different podcasts, whether that be the No Sleep podcast, Creepy Pod, or in some of the other short story collections that I've put out. It turns out that putting out 4 collections a year is a pretty heavy call, and so I've reduced it to 1. So I'm hoping to put out a collection that really once again leans into that idea of like campfire stories and the sort of stories that you would hear from a friend of a friend, or that you might have heard when you were younger from an older brother or sister and weren't quite sure whether it was true or not. So I'm looking into putting out another collection of short stories. Regarding my like historical horror fiction, I have there's a anthology published by Parsec Inc. called Hospitium, that's going to have a horror story that I wrote with a setting in ancient China, which I'm pretty excited for. And lastly, I've got a novel on the horizon. It's at a very bare bones stage, but hopefully within the next year that will have advanced quite a bit. You can find my work looking for my pen name, which is John Beardify, Beardify, and you can search for me on Reddit, and there you'll see a list of the anthologies. The first one I ever put out is called Midnight Snacks, and you can find that on Amazon. You also find a link to all the other anthologies there as well.
Thank you. Would love to support you. Is there anything that I'm forgetting, anything you want to talk about before we conclude?
I just really enjoyed the idea of the thought of the cost of living collection. That I found it to be a really cool concept for horror, and I'm excited to be part of it.
Awesome. Well, we'd love to hear from you again when we do our workplace horror collection. And other kind of mundane, everyday life type stuff. That's kind of going to be our jam for a while. And we're super glad that you submitted. Thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate your time.